Back in the 1990s, there was a drink that looked unstoppable. A brand so popular that people carried the bottles like fashion accessories. Celebrities talked about it, late-night hosts joked about it, and stores could barely keep it on the shelves. It wasn't Coke, it wasn't Pepsi, it was Snapple, the quirky little tea company from New York that somehow became one of the hottest brands in America. But then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. Billions of dollars vanished, customers disappeared, and one of the biggest companies in the world made a mistake so massive that business schools still talk about it today. So how did a small juice company rise to the top, crash in spectacular fashion, and still survive after all these years? Well, the story of Snapple is far stranger than most people realize. To understand Snapple, you have to go back to the early 1970s, long before influencer marketing, viral trends, or fancy energy drinks. At the time, America was dominated by giant soda companies. Coke and Pepsi ruled everything, and smaller drink brands rarely stood a chance. But in New York City, three friends, Leonard Marsh, Hyman Golden, and Arnold Greenberg, decided they wanted to try something different. They started a small business selling fruit juices to health food stores. Nothing glamorous, no massive factories, no billion-dollar plans. Just three guys trying to make a decent product. At first, the company was called Unadulterated Food Products, which honestly sounds less like a drink company and more like a chemistry experiment. But eventually they launched a line of fruit drinks and teas under a new name, Snapple, a mix of the words snappy and apple. And funnily enough, the name actually came from a failed carbonated apple drink that accidentally fermented inside the bottle caps, causing them to snap open. Most companies would hide a mistake like that, but somehow it became part of the identity. And in the beginning, Snapple was tiny, really tiny. The founders drove deliveries themselves. They hustled store by store, trying to convince small businesses to carry their drinks. But then something started happening in the 1980s. Americans were slowly becoming more health conscious. People wanted alternatives to sugary sodas. Bottled iced tea was becoming trendy, and Snapple found itself in the perfect position at the perfect time. But here's what made Snapple different. It didn't feel corporate. The brand felt weird, personal, almost homemade. The labels had random facts under the bottle caps. The ads were goofy, and instead of polished celebrities, Snapple used regular people, especially a woman named Wendy Kaufman, better known as the Snapple Lady. And honestly, this was genius. Wendy wasn't a model. She wasn't trying to look perfect. She simply answered fan mail in commercials with a warm New York personality. And people loved her because she felt real. Viewers trusted her. Customers felt connected to the brand. It was like hearing from your funny aunt, instead of being sold something by a corporation. This is where everything changed. By the early 1990s, Snapple exploded in popularity. The company's sales skyrocketed, convenience stores couldn't stock enough bottles, and suddenly Snapple became part of American pop culture. Athletes drank it, radio hosts mentioned it, comedians joked about it, and teenagers carried bottles everywhere. The timing couldn't have been better. At the time, bottled tea was still relatively new in the mainstream, and Snapple basically owned the category. Flavors like peach tea, lemon tea, kiwi strawberry, and mango madness became huge hits. And because the drinks felt quirky and different, customers became incredibly loyal. But perhaps the smartest thing Snapple did was distribution. Instead of relying on giant supermarket chains early on, Snapple focused heavily on small independent distributors, especially in New York and urban areas. These distributors were aggressive, motivated, and deeply connected to local stores. They pushed Snapple everywhere. Delis, gas stations, pizza shops, corner stores, and because the distributors had strong personal relationships, Snapple spread like wildfire. Soon, the numbers became insane. Snapple's annual revenue jumped from millions to hundreds of millions in just a few years. And Wall Street noticed, investors loved the company, the media loved the company, and honestly, Snapple looked unstoppable. But things didn't stay that way. Whenever a smaller company grows rapidly, giant corporations start paying attention. And in the mid-1990s, one company decided it wanted a piece of the action. That company was Quaker Oats Company. Now, this is important because Quaker Oats had recently pulled off one of the greatest business moves ever. They owned Gatorade, and Gatorade was dominating the sports drink market. Quaker believed they could repeat the same success with Snapple. So, in 1994, they bought Snapple for around $1.7 billion. At the time, it sounded brilliant. A huge corporation with massive resources was buying one of the hottest beverage brands in America. What could go wrong? Well, almost everything. And what happened next was shocking. Quaker completely misunderstood why Snapple was successful in the first place. Remember those small independent distributors that helped build the brand? Quaker didn't value them the same way. Instead, they tried to move Snapple into their larger supermarket distribution system, which sounds logical on paper. But it destroyed the grassroots network that made Snapple special. Stores stopped prioritizing the drink. Distributors became angry, and competitors quickly filled the gaps. But that wasn't the only problem. Quaker also changed the marketing strategy. The quirky personality that made Snapple unique slowly disappeared. The ads became more corporate. The humor felt forced. And even the famous Snapple Lady was pushed aside. And customers noticed, this happens more often than people think. Companies assume they can polish a brand and make it more mainstream, but sometimes the rough edges are exactly why people love it. Snapple's sales started falling, and falling fast. At the same time, competition exploded. Brands like Arizona Beverage Company entered the iced tea market with giant cans and lower prices, and suddenly Snapple no longer felt fresh and exciting. Within just a few years, Quaker's billion-dollar investment became a disaster. And then came the moment that business historians still talk about today. In 1997, only 3 years after buying Snapple for $1.7 billion, Quaker sold the company for around $300 million. Think about that for a second. They lost roughly $1.4 billion. It became one of the worst acquisitions in modern business history. And honestly, it's kind of fascinating because the product itself wasn't terrible. People still recognized the brand. Customers still had nostalgia for it. But bad decisions, bad marketing, and misunderstanding, the audience nearly destroyed everything. At this point, many people assumed Snapple was finished. Usually when a trendy brand collapses that hard, it fades away forever, but Snapple somehow survived. The company was bought by Triarch, the same group connected to brands like RC Cola and Mystic. And unlike Quaker, the new owners actually understood what Snapple had lost. So they tried bringing back the personality, the quirky marketing returned, the brand leaned into its weird identity again, and most importantly, they rebuilt relationships with smaller distributors. And slowly, Snapple started recovering, not to its massive early 1990s peak, but enough to become relevant again. This is one of the most interesting parts of the story because Snapple's comeback wasn't flashy. There wasn't one dramatic moment where everything suddenly turned around. It was more like a slow rebuilding process, almost like the brand had to rediscover itself. Then came another major turning point. In 2000, Triarch merged Snapple with other beverage businesses, and eventually the company became part of what is now Keurig Dr. Pepper. And once again, Snapple entered a new era, but the beverage world had changed dramatically. Now the shelves were packed with energy drinks, flavored waters, cold brews, kombucha, protein shakes, sparkling waters, and health drinks promising everything from better sleep to improved focus. Competition became brutal. Snapple was no longer the cool outsider. In many ways, Snapple became something else entirely, a nostalgic brand. And nostalgia is powerful. People who grew up in the 1990s remember Snapple as part of their childhood or teenage years. The glass bottles, the random facts under the caps, the weird commercials, the flavors that felt exciting at the time. For many people, drinking Snapple today feels less about the drink itself and more about remembering a certain era. But even nostalgia has limits. Over the years, Snapple faced criticism too. Some customers complained about recipe changes. Others argued the drinks weren't as healthy as the branding originally suggested, especially because many flavors still contained a lot of sugar. And then there was the famous real facts controversy. Those little facts under the caps became iconic, but people eventually discovered that some of them were inaccurate or misleading, which led to criticism and jokes online. Honestly, it sounds small, but it damaged part of the brand's quirky credibility, because the entire appeal of Snapple was authenticity. When customers stop believing the brand feels genuine, even tiny issues can become bigger problems. Still, Snapple managed to survive decades of changing trends, and that alone is impressive. Think about how many beverage crazes have come and gone. Countless brands exploded for a few years and disappeared forever. But Snapple is still here, sitting on store shelves after all the chaos. That said, the company today exists in a very different position from its golden era. Snapple is no longer leading the cultural conversation. It's not the hottest drink in America anymore. Younger audiences often gravitate toward newer brands, especially energy drinks and health-focused beverages. And social media completely changed how products become popular. Back in the 1990s, a quirky TV commercial and word of mouth could build a billion-dollar brand. Today, trends move at lightning speed. One viral TikTok can create overnight success, but it can also destroy relevance just as quickly. And honestly, Snapple feels like a reminder of a completely different marketing era. An era when brands felt smaller, stranger, and maybe even more human. What makes the Snapple story so fascinating is that it wasn't just about drinks, it was about identity. The company became successful because it understood emotion. People didn't buy Snapple only for the flavor. They bought the feeling around it, the humor, the weirdness, the authenticity, the sense that this wasn't some giant soulless corporation. Then a massive corporation took over, stripped away those qualities, and nearly killed the brand. It's almost like Snapple accidentally proved one of the biggest lessons in business. Sometimes a company's imperfections are exactly what make it valuable. And honestly, you can still see versions of this happening today. Big corporations buy trendy startups all the time, hoping to scale them into something bigger. But when they overmanage them or force them to become too polished, customers often lose interest, because people are surprisingly good at detecting when something stops feeling real. The rise and fall of Snapple also shows how unpredictable trends can be. One moment you're the hottest brand in the country. The next moment, competitors appear. Tastes change, and suddenly you're fighting just to stay relevant. That's kind of terrifying if you think about it, especially in industries built around hype and consumer attention. But maybe the most surprising part of all is that Snapple never completely disappeared. Despite billion-dollar mistakes, changing markets, failed strategies, and endless competition, the brand kept surviving, not dominating, not ruling the world, but surviving. And maybe there's something oddly admirable about that, because sometimes survival itself is a victory. So the next time you see a bottle of Snapple in a store fridge, you're not just looking at a tea company. You're looking at one of the wildest business roller coasters in American history, a brand that reached incredible heights, suffered a spectacular collapse, and somehow managed to keep going anyway. And honestly, it makes you wonder, could Snapple ever become truly huge again? Or is it destined to remain a nostalgic reminder of the 1990s? What do you think? Was Snapple ruined by corporate mistakes? Or was its downfall inevitable once the trends changed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.